Caught in the moment. Why did the giant cowboy command the stable boy to enter? Prologue, the command. The morning the giant cowboy commanded me to enter his stable office, I was covered in mud up to my elbows, smelling like horse sweat and hay, and absolutely convinced that I had made the biggest mistake of my life coming to this ranch. The August sun had already turned the Texas hill country into a slow-burning furnace, and I had been working since 4 in the morning, which meant I was running on 3 hours of sleep, half a granola bar, and a very specific kind of despair that only comes from realizing that the escape route you chose might be just as complicated as the thing you were escaping from. I had been at the Hargrove Ranch for exactly 31 days. I had spoken a total of perhaps 200 words to Colt Hargrove, and most of those had been single syllables: yes, no, done, sorry, understood. So when the stable office door swung open and that broad silhouette filled the frame and that deep voice said, without any preamble or softening, "Navarro, get in here," I felt my heart drop somewhere around my knees. I remember standing very still for a second, holding the curry comb in one hand and trying to figure out if I had done something wrong. Probably, I thought. Probably I had done something wrong. That was the story of my life, showing up somewhere new, trying my hardest, and still somehow getting it wrong. The mare beside me, a beautiful bay named Duchess, nudged my shoulder with her nose as if she was telling me to go. I patted her neck once, set the comb on the ledge of the stall, and walked toward the office door with the specific kind of dread that makes your footsteps heavier than they should be. The sunlight coming through the high stable windows was gold and thick, full of dust motes spinning slowly, and the whole place smelled of cedar and leather, and something else I had started to associate with Colt Hargrove specifically, something warm and clean, like the outdoors had soaked into his skin and lived there permanently. He was standing with his back to me when I entered, looking at something on the wall map of the property. The office was small, a battered wooden desk, 2 mismatched chairs, a coat rack with a single battered hat hanging from it, shelves of binders and log books. The window above the desk looked out onto the east pasture where 3 horses grazed in the morning light. Colt Hargrove was 6 feet 4 inches of sun-bronzed Texas rancher, and even with his back turned, the breadth of his shoulders was the first thing you noticed. Wide, solid, the kind of build that comes not from a gym, but from years of actual physical labor, from hauling fence posts and wrestling cattle and throwing hay bales before sunrise every single morning of your adult life. He wore the same thing he always wore: worn dark jeans, dusty boots, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it had gotten long. I had noticed that before. I had noticed a lot of things I had no business noticing. "Close the door," he said, without turning around. I closed it. The quiet in the room immediately became a different kind of quiet, heavier, more aware of itself. He turned then, and I made myself look at his face instead of the way the morning light fell across his forearms. He was 26, only 4 years older than me, but Colt Hargrove had a way of inhabiting space that made him feel larger than his age. Not intimidating, exactly, something more complicated than that. Something I hadn't found a word for yet in 31 days of working alongside him. His eyes were a deep shade of brown that went almost black in certain lights, and right now in the dim office they were unreadable, studying me with that calm, measuring expression that I had come to think of as his resting face. Colt Hargrove did not waste expressions. Every look meant something. I just hadn't learned the language yet. "Sit down, Navarro," he said. I sat, he didn't. He leaned back against the desk, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked at me for a moment that stretched long enough to make me want to fidget. I didn't fidget. I had learned in 31 days that showing nervousness around Colt Hargrove was like showing weakness around a horse. They could sense it, and it didn't help either of you. "You've been here a month," he said. 31 days, I agreed, then immediately wondered why I had specified. He raised an eyebrow just slightly. "Yes, 31 days, and in 31 days you haven't taken a single day off." I waited. I wasn't sure if this was a compliment or a complaint. "I need you to ride out to the north fence line tomorrow," he said. "There's a section near the creek that keeps coming down. Cattle keep finding the gap. I've fixed it twice this season, and I don't have time to ride out there again myself. I'm sending you." He paused. "Alone." I stared at him. "Alone," I repeated. "You know how to fix a fence line?" "Yes." "You know the North Pasture trails?" "I've ridden them twice, with Hector." "Good." He pushed off the desk, moved to the window, looked out at the East Pasture again. "Take Duchess. She knows the North section better than any of the others. Take the supply pack from the main shed, wire, posts, the red-handled pliers. Leave by 6. You should be back before noon." He was quiet for a second. "Unless there's a problem." "I'll handle it," I said. He looked at me over his shoulder. There was something in that glance, something brief and curious, and then carefully set aside, that made my pulse do something it had no reason to be doing at 7 in the morning in a stable office in the middle of nowhere, Texas. "I know you will," he said, and then he turned back to the window, and I understood that the conversation was over. I stood up, I walked to the door. I had my hand on the handle when his voice came again, quieter this time, almost thoughtful. "Navarro." I stopped. "You doing all right, out here?" I turned to look at him. He was still facing the window, asking the question to the East Pasture and not to me, which somehow made it easier to answer. "Yes," I said, and then, because something about the quietness of that office and the long gold morning light made me add one more word than I usually allowed myself. "Better." He nodded once, still looking out the window, and I left. Standing in the warm shadow of the stable hallway, with Duchess shifting in her stall behind me and the whole enormous ranch day stretching out ahead of me, I pressed my hand briefly against the wall and tried to understand what had just happened in that room. Nothing, I told myself. An assignment. A conversation between a ranch owner and his hired hand. That was all. I was 22 years old, 3 months out of a life I had left behind in San Antonio, and I did not need complications. I had come to the Hargrove Ranch specifically to avoid complications. The problem, I was beginning to understand, was that some complications arrived quietly, like weather you don't see coming until you're already caught in it. Let me back up, because the story of how I ended up as a stable hand on Colt Hargrove's ranch in the hill country of Texas is the kind of story that sounds simple from the outside and is considerably more complicated from the inside, which is true of most stories that matter. My name is Rafael Navarro. I grew up in San Antonio, the second son of a family that ran a small auto repair shop on the south side, surrounded by the organized chaos of engines and invoices, and 3 older cousins who were always coming and going and had loud opinions about everything. I was the quiet one. I had always been the quiet one. My mother used to say that I was born watching the world instead of participating in it, which she meant kindly, but which I came to understand was also a polite way of saying that I held myself apart from things in a way that wasn't always healthy. I went to UT San Antonio for 2 years, studying landscape architecture because I genuinely loved it, loved the idea of shaping outdoor spaces, of understanding how land and water and plant life interact, of making environments that people could breathe in. I was good at it. My professors said so. I had friends, a social life, a direction that felt real, and I had Marcus. Marcus Reyes, who was my roommate first, then my closest friend, then something else entirely for a period of about 14 months that changed the architecture of my interior life in ways I was still mapping when I decided to leave San Antonio in May. I don't want to spend too long on Marcus, because this story isn't about him, not really. But you can't understand why I came to the Hargrove Ranch without understanding what it felt like to realize that the person you had trusted most with the quieter, truer parts of yourself had been treating your vulnerability like a resource rather than a gift. Not cruelly. Marcus was never cruel. He was just careless in the particular way that people who have never had to protect themselves tend to be careless with people who have learned to protect themselves very carefully. When it ended, and it ended in the specific, exhausting way that slow realizations end, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a long, quiet conversation at 2 in the morning, in which both of us said things that were true and kind and still somehow devastating. I felt the need to put a significant amount of physical space between myself and every single thing I recognized. My uncle Rodrigo had a connection to a ranch owner in Fredericksburg who was looking for seasonal help. He mentioned it in passing at a family dinner. I said yes before he finished the sentence. 3 weeks later, I was on a highway heading north with everything I owned in the back of my truck and a very deliberate intention not to think too hard about any of it. The Hargrove Ranch was about 15 miles outside of Fredericksburg, down a county road that turned to gravel and then to dirt, and eventually opened onto a property so big it took me a full minute of driving through the front gate before I could see the main house. It was beautiful in the way that undeveloped Texas land is beautiful, expansive and honest, and slightly overwhelming, all rolling hills covered in cedar and live oak, limestone outcroppings rising white from the grass, the air smelling of juniper and heat and distance. The kind of landscape that makes you feel small in a way that's almost a relief. The foreman, a weathered man named Hector Garza who had worked the ranch for 12 years and had the kind of permanent squint that comes from decades of looking into bright skies, met me at the main shed and showed me around with the efficient warmth of someone who has done this many times and has learned to calibrate exactly how much friendliness seasonal workers require. He showed me the bunkhouse, the stables, the feed barn, the equipment shed, the trails. He explained the schedule. He pointed out which horses I would be working with and which ones had personalities that required patience. He did not introduce me to Colt Hargrove. I met Colt Hargrove the next morning at 5 a.m. in the dark of the stable, when I arrived early because I couldn't sleep and found him already there, alone, brushing down a big gray gelding named Atlas with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who is in exactly the right place and knows it. He didn't startle when I came in. He didn't seem surprised. He just looked up, looked at me for a moment with those quiet, dark eyes and said, "You're Navarro." "Yes, sir," I said. "Don't call me sir," he said. "I'm Colt," and he went back to brushing Atlas. That was our first conversation, 30 seconds, and somehow in those 30 seconds, I learned more about Colt Hargrove than I would learn in formal conversation for the next 2 weeks, that he was comfortable in silence, that he didn't perform friendliness, that he was direct without being blunt, and that he had a quality I would spend a long time trying to name, a kind of complete presentness, as if whatever he was doing at any given moment had his full and genuine attention. No performance, no distance, just here now this. I found it unusual, I found it restful, and I found it, in a way I was not ready to examine, quietly compelling. The first weeks of ranch work were hard in the specific, physical way that I had anticipated, but that my body had not. I was 22 and reasonably fit, but stable work uses muscles in patterns that no gym prepares you for, and by the end of the first week, I was falling asleep before 8 o'clock and waking up sore in places I hadn't previously thought of as muscles. Hector was patient and practical in his teaching. The other seasonal hands, 2 brothers from Uvalde named Tomás and Dante, and a quiet older man named Gil, were easy enough to get along with. The horses were the best part. I had grown up around horses peripherally, my uncle had a few, but I had never worked with them at this level, this daily intimate proximity, and I discovered that I loved it in a specific and immediate way, the way you love something that is both more demanding and more rewarding than you expected. And Colt Hargrove moved through all of it, through the ranch, through the days, through the work, like the center of gravity of the entire operation, which technically he was. The ranch had been his family's for 3 generations. His father had retired to Kerrville 2 years earlier and handed the whole thing to Colt, who had been running it as the acting foreman anyway since he was 21. Every decision on the property ultimately came back to him, but he didn't wear that authority heavily or obviously. He worked alongside the hands, not above them. He fixed fences and moved cattle and mucked stalls on the same days he did the books and dealt with the suppliers. He had a quiet accountability to every part of the operation that I had never seen in a person in charge of anything, and it made me, someone who had spent a significant portion of my life being suspicious of authority, instinctively trust him. I kept my distance anyway. It was what I knew how to do. I rode out to the north fence line the next morning with Duchess beneath me and the early light turning the hills copper and gold, and I thought about the way Colt had said, I know you will. 2 words, 3 syllables. And yet I had turned them over in my mind for the better part of the night, examining them from different angles the way you examine a stone you found in a field, not sure if it's just a rock or if it's something worth keeping. The trail to the north pasture went up through a section of cedar breaks and then opened onto a long limestone ridge with views of the valley below that were, on a clear August morning, genuinely staggering. Duchess picked her way along the trail with the confidence of a horse who has done this 1,000 times and finds the terrain interesting rather than difficult. I gave her the reins and let her set the pace and tried to remember the last time I had felt as uncomplicated as this. Just a man on a horse in the morning, heading toward a simple task with clear parameters. I found the fence gap where Hector had told me it would be, near the creek crossing where the ground was softer and the posts had a tendency to work loose in the wet seasons. The cattle had pushed through twice already, leaving muddy tracks on both sides of the wire. I tied Duchess to a cedar, unloaded the supply pack, and got to work with the methodical, grounding focus that physical labor, done well, always gave me. I had been working for about an hour, deep in the satisfaction of it, when I heard hoofbeats. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the rising sun, and watched Colt Hargrove come around the bend of the trail on Atlas, moving at an easy trot that he brought down to a walk when he saw me. He stopped, looked at the fence, looked at me, looked at the fence again. "You found it," he said. "You said near the creek crossing," I said. "It was near the creek crossing." He swung down from Atlas with the practiced ease of someone who has spent more of his life on horseback than off it, tied the reins to a branch, and came to look at what I had done. He crouched down, examined the new post, ran his hand along the wire, checked the tension. I stood slightly back and watched him do this, and tried not to notice the way the morning light landed across the back of his neck. "Good," he said. He straightened up. He was close enough now that I could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the ones that came from squinting into the sun for years. Tension's right. "I did this kind of work on my uncle's property," I said, "when I was a teenager." He looked at me. It was the kind of look that wanted more information but wasn't going to demand it. "In San Antonio," he said. "Outside the city, he had a small place, nothing like this." Colt looked out over the valley. The creek below us was low but running, catching the morning light in broken flashes. Cicadas had started up in the cedar breaks. The whole world smelled of limestone and juniper and warm horse and cut wire. "You're not from ranch country," he said. It wasn't a question, not unfriendly, just observational. "No," I said. "What made you want to come out here?" I had been waiting for this question since I arrived. Everyone who worked the land long enough eventually asked it of the people who came to it from somewhere else. I had a prepared answer, wanted something different, needed a change of scenery, interested in outdoor work. All true enough to serve as an answer. But standing on that ridge in the morning light with Colt Hargrove looking at me with his calm, genuinely curious expression, I found that my prepared answer didn't quite make it out of my mouth. What came out instead was this: I needed somewhere that was just about the work. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah," in a tone that suggested he understood that answer better than most. We fixed the remaining loose wire together, without much conversation, and then we rode back toward the ranch side by side on the trail, Duchess and Atlas walking at an easy pace in the cedar-filtered morning light. Colt pointed out landmarks as we went: the old stone foundation of the original homestead building, a spring-fed tank that didn't appear on the newer maps, a ridge where he had seen a black bear once, several years ago, which he mentioned with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting something interesting rather than alarming. I listened and asked questions, and found that talking to him was easier on horseback than it was anywhere else. Something about the movement, the parallel direction, the fact that you were looking at the same landscape rather than at each other. It made conversation feel less like a performance and more like just two people sharing the same view. "How long have you had Duchess?" I asked. 8 years, he said. "She was my mother's horse originally. When my mother moved into town, she left Duchess here." A pause. "Duchess didn't want to go anyway." How could you tell? He considered this seriously. She was calmer out here. In the paddock in town, she got restless. Out here, she settled. He looked at the horse, then back at the trail. Some animals are just made for open space. You can tell because they're different people in it. I thought about that. I thought about how in San Antonio, in the apartment I had shared with Marcus, in the university studio, in my family's crowded house, I had always felt the specific low-grade restlessness of someone in a space that wasn't quite right for them. I had assumed it was about Marcus, or about school, or about not knowing myself well enough. But out here, in 31 days of open landscape and physical work and very little noise, I had started to wonder if it was simpler than that. Maybe I'm like that, I said, mostly to myself. Colt looked at me briefly. Maybe, he said, and then we were quiet for the rest of the ride home, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The rhythm of ranch life in summer had a quality I came to think of as radical simplicity. You woke early because the work required it. You worked your body until it was genuinely tired rather than just mentally exhausted. You ate real food at real mealtimes because hunger was a physical fact rather than something you forgot about under fluorescent lighting. And you slept deeply and completely in a way I had not slept in years. Within 3 weeks of arriving, I had the kind of internal quiet that I had previously only achieved for brief windows in meditation or exercise. I was sleeping 7 hours a night without waking. My shoulders had stopped carrying the specific tension that had lived in them since approximately my junior year of high school. The bunkhouse where the seasonal hand stayed was a converted outbuilding with 4 cots, a small bathroom, a window unit that worked about 70% of the time, and a screen porch where we sat in the evenings while the light went out of the sky in long orange gradients. Tomás and Dante played cards most evenings. Gil read paperback westerns with a consistency that suggested he had been doing this every evening of his adult life. I sat on the porch and sometimes wrote in the journal I'd started keeping, and sometimes just watched the darkness come in across the hills and felt, with a regularity that still surprised me, something that was close to peace. Colt lived in the main house, which was a proper old ranch house about 200 yards from the outbuildings, stone foundation, wide porch, the kind of place that had been added onto over generations and wore its own history visibly. You could see lights in it at night, sometimes late, which I assumed was the books and the business end of running a ranch of this size. He kept his personal life separate from the working hours in a way that was professional and clear, and which I respected. Though I was aware of myself respecting it in the specific way you respect a boundary that you are also, quietly, curious about. The crew ate dinner together in the ranch kitchen most nights, a big practical kitchen with a long table, where Hector's wife Esperanza cooked 4 nights a week, and the rest of the time it was whoever felt like cooking. Colt ate with the crew more often than you'd expect of a ranch owner. He sat at the end of the table and listened more than he talked, which was consistent with his general approach to everything, and occasionally said something that reoriented the whole conversation without seeming to try. I had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when Esperanza made tamales on a Friday night, and the whole table got louder and more relaxed than usual. Even Colt was different, less contained, more present in the room in a way that included everyone at the table. He told a story about a bull that had escaped and ended up standing in the middle of the county road for 20 minutes, traffic backed up in both directions, 3 different attempts to get it moving failing completely until Hector's dog showed up, and the bull just turned around and walked home. He told it plainly, with dry humor, and the whole table laughed. It was the first time I had heard him tell something like a story, and I sat at the other end of the table and watched him do it, and felt something shift inside me that I immediately classified as not a useful thing to feel. After dinner most nights, he went back to the main house. Occasionally, he stayed on the bunkhouse porch for a while. The first time he did this, maybe 10 days into my time there, I was the only one still outside, everyone else having gone in early, and he came across the yard and said, "Mind if I sit?" And I said no, and he sat in the other porch chair, and we were quiet together for about 20 minutes while the night insects made their sound in the cedar, and the stars came out in the particular extravagant density that you only see in dark sky country. It was one of the least complicated things that had happened to me in a long time. Two people sitting in the dark looking at the same sky. And then he said, "Night," and went back to the house, and I stayed on the porch a while longer feeling something I couldn't name and wasn't going to try. He did this maybe twice a week, never announced it, never made it into anything. He would appear on the porch, sit for a while, sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and then he went back to the house. I started, without intending to, thinking of it as part of the evening rhythm. I started, without intending to, staying on the porch longer than I needed to. Tamars noticed. Tamars noticed everything and then said it aloud, which was the thing about Tamars. "You and the boss are getting friendly," he said one morning, not accusingly, but with the observational brightness of someone who finds human behavior interesting. "We sit on the porch sometimes," I said. "He doesn't do that with everyone," Tamars said. "He does whatever he does," I said. "Can you hand me that lead rope?" Tamars handed me the lead rope with the expression of someone who has more to say and is choosing, generously, not to say it. The second week of August brought a storm system down from the north that everyone had seen coming on the weather app for 4 days, and that still, somehow, managed to arrive in a way that felt sudden. It started as wind in the afternoon, the particular insistent Texas wind that precedes serious weather, and by evening the clouds had come in low and dark, and the air had that charged, electric quality that makes horses nervous and humans hyper-aware. We got the horses in before dark, all 11 of them, which with nervous horses in building weather took the whole crew working quickly and calmly. Colt worked at the far end of the stable, handling the most reactive animals, a young stallion named Trigger who didn't trust anyone in unsettled weather, and a mare named Rosalind who had been kicked by lightning-panicked cattle once in her youth and had not forgotten it. I watched him with them from across the stable, handling 2 frightened 1,200-pound animals with a steadiness that was almost breathtaking, calm, firm, present, completely unrattled by their fear. Trigger eventually put his head down and let himself be led. Rosalind pressed her nose against Colt's chest and trembled, and he stood there and let her, one hand on her neck, until the trembling stopped. I had to look away. There was something too private about it, too genuinely tender, and I felt suddenly like I was seeing something I hadn't been meant to see. The storm hit around 9 at night. It was substantial, rolling thunder, sheet lightning, rain coming in sideways with enough force to rattle the bunkhouse windows. The power went out around 9:30. Gil produced a battery lantern from under his cot with the calm of a man who has been through this before. Tamars and Dante played cards by lantern light and argued about whether gin rummy or poker was the more intellectually demanding game. I sat on my cot and listened to the rain and tried to read and couldn't concentrate. Around 10, I got up, put on my rain jacket, and went to check on the horses. I knew they had been settled before the storm hit. I knew Hector had done a final check at 8. I went anyway because I was restless and the horses were a good reason to be outside and moving. The stable was warmer than the outside air, smelling of hay and animal warmth, the sound of the rain muffled but still audible on the metal roof. The horses were restless but not panicked. Trigger paced in his stall, Rosalind had her ears pinned, but the others were settled enough. I walked the length of the stable, checking each stall, talking quietly, the kind of low, steady voice that horses find calming. Duchess pressed her nose into my palm when I got to her stall, and I stood with her for a while, scratching behind her ears, feeling the storm rage outside and the warmth inside, and was just starting to feel genuinely calm when the stable door opened and Colt came in. He was wet. He had clearly come from the main house in the storm and hadn't bothered with a jacket, just a flannel shirt that was dark with rain across the shoulders. He stopped when he saw me, and I saw something cross his face, surprise, and then something that smoothed over it quickly. "I came to check on the horses," I said, because the silence needed something in it. "Me too," he said. He looked at Rosalind's stall. "She handling it?" "Better than expected," I said. He nodded, came down the row of stalls, checking each one, the same walk I had just done. I stayed at Duchess's stall and watched him do it without pretending I wasn't watching. In the storm-warm stable, in the yellow lantern light that Gil had left hanging on the post, he moved with the same unhurried steadiness as always. His wet shirt clung across his shoulders. His hair was dark with rain. He stopped at Trigger's stall, talked to the young stallion for a moment in a low voice I couldn't make out over the rain on the roof, and the horse settled and stopped packing. When he came back down the row, he stopped at Duchess's stall, across the partition from me. There was perhaps 3 feet between us, and the stable was warm and close, and outside the thunder rolled again, and Duchess flicked her ears. "You couldn't sleep," he said. "I was reading," I said, "couldn't concentrate." "What was you reading?" I told him. He looked slightly surprised and then interested. He had read the same book, apparently 3 years ago, while waiting in a hospital in San Antonio. His father had had a procedure, and Colt had sat in a waiting room for 6 hours with nothing but the book someone had left on a chair. "Did you finish it?" I asked. "In the waiting room," he said. "Read the whole thing." A pause. "Dad came out fine." "Good," I said. Thunder again, closer. Rosalind made a sound and Colt looked at her stall and then looked back at me. He was quiet for a moment. "What did you think of the ending?" he said. We talked about the book for 20 minutes, standing in the warm stable with the storm outside, and I watched the way his face changed when he talked about something he had actually thought about. The reserve dropped slightly, not gone entirely but present differently, and underneath it was something alive and engaged and specific that I found I very much wanted to see more of. He had strong opinions. He explained them carefully. He asked questions that suggested he was genuinely interested in what I thought, not just waiting for his turn to say something. At some point, we had stopped pretending we were there to check on the horses. At some point, we had moved slightly closer together in the natural way that people do in small spaces during conversations that are going well, until there were maybe 18 inches between us instead of 3 feet, and neither of us had commented on it. At some point, I noticed that I was smiling, and that it felt involuntary, and that he was too, a smaller smile, controlled, the corners of his mouth doing something careful. The power came back on, buzzing the stable lights to life. We both looked up at the sudden brightness, and I saw him blink in the light, and in the full brightness, his expression was different, not closed exactly, but more aware of itself, more careful. "I should get back," he said. "Yeah," I said. He reached past me to check the latch on Duchess's stall door. His arm came close enough to my shoulder that I could feel the warmth of it without contact. Then he stepped back, and the warmth was gone, and he said goodnight and walked toward the stable door, and I watched him go with the very specific feeling of someone watching a door close behind something they're not ready to stop looking at. I stayed with Duchess for another half hour. She was calm now, the storm having moved east. I pressed my forehead against her neck and breathed in the warm horse smell and thought about 18 inches and the way his face looked when he talked about something real, and I told myself very firmly that none of this was anything. I wasn't sure I believed myself. It is difficult to identify the exact moment when something between two people shifts from one thing into another. Later, when I tried to trace it, I kept arriving at different moments. The conversation in the stable during the storm, the first night on the porch, the fence line at the creek, the word better in the stable office. But the truth is that shifts like that don't happen at a moment. They happen in accumulation, slowly, the way water carves stone, not with a single strike, but with the persistence of contact over time. What I can say is that after the storm, something was different in a way that was visible to me, even if it was visible to no one else. The careful professional distance that Colt maintained with everyone on the ranch, consistent, appropriate, clearly drawn, seemed to have a small exception in it that had not been there before. He stopped by Duchess's stall more often when I was working there. He asked my opinion on things, the east pasture drainage, which trail to use for the cattle drive to the lower section, whether a particular stretch of fence looked stable. These were things he could have asked Hector, who had 12 years of institutional knowledge on the property. He asked me, and he listened to what I said with the expression of someone taking information seriously. I noticed this. I catalogued it with the care of someone who has learned to be cautious about the things they notice, and I kept my responses measured and practical and gave no sign that I was turning every small moment over in my mind later, examining it, wondering what it meant. The thing about being a quiet person is that the interior landscape is considerably more active than the exterior one. On the outside, I was a reliable, efficient, increasingly skilled ranch hand who did his work, got along with everyone, and kept to himself appropriately. On the inside, I was having an experience that was becoming more complicated by the day, and it was the last thing I had come here for, and I didn't know what to do with it. I knew what I felt. I had learned, in the aftermath of Marcus, to be honest with myself about what I felt even when I wasn't ready to be honest about it with anyone else. What I felt was this. I was drawn to Colt Hargrove in a way that went past professional respect or uncomplicated friendship or even the simple admiration you might feel for someone who is very good at the thing they do. I found myself aware of him in rooms in a way that was physical and involuntary. I thought about things he had said at unexpected moments, in the middle of feeding horses or falling asleep or lying in my bunk in the early morning before the day started. I noticed small things, the way he tilted his head slightly when he was thinking, the specific cadence of his laugh, which was quiet and infrequent, and when it came, genuinely unguarded, the fact that he drank his coffee black and scalding and had somehow never burned himself. None of this, I told myself, was going to be useful information. He was my employer. I knew almost nothing concrete about his life, but I knew that men like Colt, who had grown up on ranches in small-town Texas, who ran family operations that were tied to the land and the community and the accumulated expectations of generations, men like that generally did not feel toward other men what I was starting to feel toward him. That was a story I had no business casting myself in. And even if I was wrong about that, even if by some improbable miracle the landscape of his interior matched mine in some way, I was a seasonal hand. I was temporary. I had come here to get my head clear and my heart quiet, and starting something complicated with my employer in a very isolated place, with nowhere to go if it went wrong, was exactly the kind of self-sabotaging decision I had supposedly come here to stop making. I kept all of this very neatly contained. I was good at containing things. And then on a Wednesday morning in the third week of August, Colt asked if I wanted to come with him to check on the cattle in the far south pasture, a 2-hour ride that none of the other hands had come along on. He asked in the same casual, practical tone he used for everything. I said sure, and we rode out at 8 in the morning, and we were gone until past noon, and somewhere in those 4 hours in the quiet open country with no one else around for miles, the thing I had been very carefully containing became significantly harder to contain. It was the cumulative effect of being that close to someone for that long in a landscape that big and that honest. It was the conversation about what we had both wanted to be when we were younger and what had happened to those plans and how we both felt about it. It was watching him work the cattle with a calm authority that the animals responded to as if it were a language they had been born knowing. It was the moment when we stopped by a tank for the horses to drink and sat side by side on a limestone outcropping with our boots in the shade, and he said, looking out at the far hills, "I used to think I'd leave. When I was 16, 17, I had all these plans." And then was quiet, and I waited, because I had learned by then that Colt continued things when he was ready. And then I came back from a semester at A&M and drove through the front gate and just thought, no. This is it. This is mine. "Do you regret not leaving?" I asked. He thought about it, genuinely considered it, which was his way with questions. "No," he said, "but I think about it sometimes. The road not taken." He looked at me. "What about you? Is landscape architecture the road not taken, or are you still on it?" I had not told him my field of study. I had not told anyone on the ranch. I stared at him. "How did you know that?" "Your uncle mentioned it to the contact who connected you to us," he said. "I read the application." "Right," I said. "Of course he had. He was methodical about everything." "I don't know yet," I said, honestly. "I think I needed to step away from it to figure out if I still wanted it. And I think the land part of it is real. I said slowly. The understanding how spaces work, how living things respond to their environment. I think that part is genuinely mine. The formal academic application of it, I'm less sure about. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you'd be good at it. Landscape architecture. Understanding how spaces work, he said. You watch things, you notice what's there. Something about being seen that specifically and calmly made my chest do something complicated. I looked out at the water in the tank, reflecting the big Texas sky, and breathed carefully and said, "Thank you," in what I hoped was a normal voice. He went back to looking at the hills. I went back to looking at the water, and the silence between us was the particular kind of silence that is not empty. I want to be honest about the jealousy, because it was not one of my better moments, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. His name was Drew Calloway, and he arrived in the last week of August, a friend of Colt's from college, apparently, who came down from Austin for a long weekend on the ranch. He was tall, easygoing, and handsome in a blonde, open-faced way, and he and Colt had the history-thick ease of two people who have known each other since they were young and have accumulated enough shared memory to populate entire conversations with references no one else understands. I disliked him unreasonably and immediately, and I was not proud of this. Drew Calloway was not a bad person. He was friendly to the hands, helped with chores without being asked, had a good laugh, and clearly made Colt happy in the specific way that old friendship does, loosening something in him that was usually held more carefully, making him quicker to smile, more expansive in his storytelling. Over the weekend, they stayed up late on the main house porch talking and laughing, the sound of it carrying across the yard to the bunkhouse where I lay in my cot listening to it and feeling, with the comprehensive self-awareness of someone who knows exactly how irrational they are being, comprehensively irrational. On the Saturday afternoon, Drew and Colt rode out together on Atlas and a horse named Coyote that Drew had apparently ridden before on previous visits. I watched them ride out from the stable yard and felt something that I identified with clinical accuracy as jealousy. Specifically, the kind of jealousy that hurts not because you have a claim, but because you are aware that you don't and never will. Tamaz appeared beside me with a lead rope and said, with characteristic directness, "You look like you swallowed something bad." "I'm fine," I said. "You've been watching that trail since they left," he said. "I was thinking." "About what?" "About the North Pasture drainage issue," I said, with more conviction than it deserved. Tamaz looked at me for a long, considering moment, and I looked back at him and tried to maintain an expression of complete neutrality, and then he said, "Chem," and went back to the horse he'd been tending, and I could tell from the particular shape of that Chem that he was filing this information somewhere he would likely return to. Drew left on Sunday afternoon. Colt drove him to the end of the county road to meet his ride, and when he came back, he was quieter than usual in the way that comes from a good visit ending rather than from anything wrong. He did a late check of the stables. I was still there, finishing up the evening feeding, and we moved around each other in the comfortable choreography we had developed without ever namming it, and at some point he said, "Drew says the ranch is good for me." "Is he right?" I said. "Yeah," Colt said. He had his back to me, checking the water level in Rosalind's trough. He said I seem more settled than last time he visited. "When was last time?" "November, he paused. It was a hard fall." I waited to see if he was going to continue. He didn't, not immediately. He moved to Atlas's stall, checked the latch. "Ranch stuff," I said after a moment. "Some of that," he said, "other things." He looked at me then directly, and there was something in his expression that I hadn't seen before, not vulnerability, exactly, but a deliberate lowering of something that was usually up. "It doesn't matter. It was November and it's August now." He almost smiled. "Things change." "They do," I said. He looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he said goodnight and left the stable. I stood in the warm seedy and hay smelling dark and thought about a hard November and things changing and the word settled, and tried very hard not to construct a narrative from any of it. I constructed a narrative from all of it. It happened on a Friday evening in September, which in the hill country is when the heat finally starts to ease, and the evenings take on a quality of air that is different from summer, cooler, cleaner, smelling of different things. I was on the bunkhouse porch. Everyone else had gone to town for the evening, to Mars and Dante, to a bar, Gil to a friend's place in Fredericksburg. I had declined to go, which no one had made into a thing, because by September I had been there long enough that my preference for porch evenings over bar evenings was established and accepted. I was writing in my journal when I heard his boots on the gravel and looked up to see Colt crossing the yard toward the porch. He had a bottle of beer in each hand. He held one up, offering, and I nodded, and he came up the porch steps and handed me one and sat in the other chair, and we looked at the dark hills for a while without saying anything. At some point he said, "How much longer is your contract?" "Through November," I said. "Hector mentioned there might be winter work available if I wanted it." "There is," he said. "Maintenance, smaller crew, less exciting." "That's fine," I said. He was quiet, looking at the hills, the early stars. "Do you want it?" he asked. I looked at him. He was looking at the hills. Not at me, but there was something careful in the question, something that was asking more than the literal words, or maybe I was projecting, or maybe both were true. "I think so," I said. "I like it here." And then, because the evening was soft and the beer was cold and I was tired of being completely contained, more than I expected to. He looked at me then. In the porch light, his face was half in shadow, and I couldn't read everything in it, but there was something there, attentive, something more than attentive. "Navarro," he said, and then he stopped. I waited. "Raphael," he said. I had not heard him use my first name before. It landed in the air between us with a weight that the name itself didn't usually carry. "Yeah," I said. He looked down at his bottle, turned it in his hands. He was a man who was careful with words in the way that men who have grown up, where words were used sparingly, tend to be, and I could see him working through something, choosing. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and if I've misread the situation, then I apologize, and we don't ever have to discuss it again, and nothing changes." My heart was doing something specific and urgent. "Okay," I said. He looked at me, directly, the way he looked at things when he was being fully honest about them. "I think about you," he said, "outside of work, outside of," he paused, "more than I should, probably, given what makes sense, and I don't know what to do with that, and I've been sitting with it for a while, and I thought it was better to say it than not to." He took a breath, "Even if nothing comes of it." The night around us was very quiet. The cedar breaks were dark against the lighter dark of the sky. A single light was on in the main house window. I thought about 31 days of containing things. I thought about the storm and the creek and the south pasture. I thought about Drew Calloway and the jealousy I had no right to. I thought about Marcus and the San Antonio apartment and the careful, exhausted way I had driven north in May looking for somewhere that was just about the work. "I think about you too," I said. "I've been trying not to." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his shoulders changed, not dramatically, just a slight release of something held. "Because of the situation," he said, "not a question, understanding it." "Because of the situation," I agreed. "You're my employer, I'm temporary. I didn't come here to start something complicated." "No," he said. "And I don't know anything about," I stopped. How to say this without making assumptions he hadn't given me the right to make. "About me," he said. "Yes." He was quiet again, the beer bottle turned in his hands. Then he said, carefully, "I haven't talked about it much. It's not something there's not a lot of space for it in a place like this, not historically." He looked at the hills, "but it's there." Something about the plainness of that statement, the specific courage it took to say in that specific context, made my chest hurt in a way that was not unpleasant. "I'm not temporary if I take the winter position," I said. I wasn't sure why I said it. It was the most forward thing I had said in the conversation. He looked at me, slow, considering. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in the same family. "No," he said, "you're not." We sat on the porch for 2 more hours that night. We talked about things that had nothing to do with what had just been said, and also entirely about it, about what we'd wanted when we were younger, about the specific geography of our families and how they had shaped us, about things that had hurt us and how we had gotten through. He told me more about the hard November. I told him more about Marcus. We spoke carefully, like people handling something real and fragile, but we spoke honestly, and there was a relief in it that I felt in my whole body. When he finally stood to go in, he paused at the top of the porch steps and looked back at me. "I'm not in a hurry," he said, "just so you know." "Neither am I said. He nodded. He went across the yard toward the main house. Halfway there he stopped and looked back at me once, briefly, and I raised my hand slightly, and he did the same, and then he went in, and the main house door closed behind him. I stayed on the porch until past midnight, feeling the September air and the quiet of the ranch around me, and trying to identify the thing I was feeling and deciding that it was hope, which was an unusual thing for me to feel, which was, I decided, looking at the stars, a good sign. Here is what not being in a hurry looked like, in practice. It looked like mornings in the stable where we worked alongside each other in the comfortable choreography of shared routine, and the air between us was the same but also different, charged with something acknowledged, something that had been named and therefore had weight. It looked like looks that lasted a second longer than necessary, and the specific awareness of each other's presence in a room that we hadn't quite had before, or had had but hadn't admitted to. It looked like Duchess's stall in the late afternoon when we both ended up there at the same time, and the space felt smaller than it used to. He was serious about not rushing, and I was grateful for that, because I was not in a state of life where I could rush into anything with integrity. I was still coming out of something, still finding the shape of myself in the aftermath of a relationship that had cost me some of the trust I had in my own judgment. I needed to take this slowly. And Colt seemed to understand that without me having to explain it, in the same way he seemed to understand a lot of things without requiring them to be explained, reading the situation the way he read horses, the way he read the land, attending. What we did was this: we kept doing what we had been doing, but with everything open between us. The evening conversations on the porch, the rides to check the far pastures, the late nights in the stable when the weather was uncertain. All of it continued, and into all of it went the understanding we had reached on that Friday evening in September, and everything felt clearer for it even when it was also harder. There were hard days, days when I woke up and thought about how impractical all of this was, the geography, the context, the fact that I had arrived here specifically to avoid entanglement. Days when the fear that I would misjudge this the way I had misjudged Marcus sat in my chest like a stone, and I was quiet and careful in a way that probably showed, because Colt would look at me with that reading expression and not push but be more present, closer without crowding, available without demanding. There were also days that were the opposite, days when I was so comprehensively, simply happy in the life I was living that I couldn't quite believe it was real. Early mornings on horseback when the light was coming up over the hills and Colt was riding beside me and we were talking about something small and ordinary, and I thought, This is what it feels like when a place is right for you. October came in. The leaves on the cypresses along the creek turned gold, and the air on the morning rides had a crispness that the summer had kept secret. The cattle had been moved to the south pastures, the fence line work was largely done for the season, and the pace of the ranch slowed into the more deliberate rhythm of fall. On a Saturday evening in the second week of October, Colt asked if I wanted to ride out to the South Ridge to see the sunset. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ornamentation. We rode out at 5, made the ridge by 5:30, and tied the horses to a live oak at the edge of the outcropping that looked west over miles of hill country rolling into the distance. The sun was going down in the specific way of October sunsets in that part of Texas. Long, slow, colors you can watch change if you're patient. We sat on the limestone with our backs against a boulder and watched it happen. The horses grazed behind us. The whole valley below was gold and then orange, and then a deep rose color that made everything look like it had been painted with specific intentions. I don't remember exactly how the conversation drifted from the sunset to other things, but at some point, we had stopped looking at the horizon and were looking at each other, and the distance between us on the limestone was nothing, 6 inches maybe, and the air at that altitude was cool, and the sky above us had gone purple. He reached out and put his hand over mine, not dramatically, just placed his hand over my hand on the limestone, warm and steady. I turned my hand over under his, and he looked at me when I did, and his expression was the most open I had ever seen it, the careful reserve set down completely. And underneath, it was something that was exactly what I had feared, and exactly what I had hoped for. "You know," he said, very quietly, "I've been building fence in my head since September." I laughed, which surprised both of us. "What?" "Finding things to fix," he said, "so there was a reason to ride out together." "The creek crossing," I said. "Fixed it myself the week before you arrived," he said, "came right back down." I laughed again, quieter. He was smiling, that rare, real, unguarded smile. We sat there in the last of the October light, with his hand covering mine, and the valley going dark below us, and neither of us moving toward anything or away from anything. Just present, just here, now, this. When the light was gone, and the stars were starting, we rode back down the trail together, and at the stable yard he stood at the fence while I took Duchess in, and when I came back out, he was still there, and in the dark of the stable yard, with the lantern light coming from the bunkhouse window, we were very close and very quiet, and the moment had a specific gravity to it. He raised his hand and pushed back the brim of my hat slightly, which he had not done before, which was so casual and so intimate at once that I felt the warmth of it in my whole chest. Then he stepped back, gave me room, and said good night. I stood in the stable yard and watched him cross to the main house and thought, I am completely in trouble, and then I thought, I don't care even a little bit. Every slow burn has its interruption, its period of cold and distance, the thing that comes in and complicates what was building. I have gone back over hours many times, trying to identify where the misunderstanding entered, and I think it came from the visit of Margaret Hargrove. Colt's mother arrived in October on a Tuesday with no announcement, driving up the gravel road in a truck that made Hector straighten up, and Colt walked to the main house immediately. She stayed for 4 days. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with a warm manner and an alert quality that suggested she missed nothing, and she was clearly very fond of her son and very interested in the operation of the ranch, and incidentally, in everyone who worked there. She was particularly interested in me, which I attributed at first to the fact that I was new and seasonal workers came and went. She asked me thoughtful questions about my background, my family, my studies. She was gracious and not intrusive. I liked her. What I didn't see until it was already in motion was that she had a neighbor's daughter, a woman named Claire who was home from graduate school, who she invited for dinner on the second evening. Claire was intelligent and easy to talk to, and in a different life, I would have enjoyed dinner with her simply as a new acquaintance. But the dinner had an arrangement to it, a specific warmth directed between Claire and Colt, and Margaret Hargrove's pleased, watchful attention to both of them that was unmistakable. I was not at the dinner. The hands ate separately when family visited, but Hector's wife Esperanza, who had been in the kitchen, mentioned it the next morning to no one in particular and everyone at once in the way that she sometimes did, describing how nice it had been to see Colt laugh like that, and what a lovely girl Claire was. I heard this over my coffee, said nothing, and went to the stable, and spent the morning being more thorough about cleaning stalls than was strictly necessary. Colt didn't come to the bunkhouse porch that week while his mother was visiting, which was entirely appropriate. His mother was there, his attention was elsewhere, there was no reason for him to do so. But I had gotten used to the rhythm of the porch evenings, and their absence in the same week as the dinner information settled into me in a way that I recognized, unhappily, as familiar. The cold feeling, the one that says, you misread it, you got ahead of yourself again. Margaret left on Friday. On Saturday morning Colt was in the stable when I arrived, and the situation felt different. He was present, but somehow further away than he had been, not unkind but less available, and I could not tell if this was my projection or a real shift. He mentioned that Claire was a friend of the family and had come to say hello to his mother. He said this without preamble, which meant he knew that I had heard about the dinner, which meant Esperanza had told him that she had mentioned it. The transparency of this small chain was both reassuring and mortifying. "You don't have to explain anything," I said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." "I'm not," I stopped. I was going to say I'm not assuming anything, which was partially true. "It's not my business," I finished instead. He looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen before, something frustrated and patient at once. "Raphael," he said. "It's fine," I said. I picked up the curry comb. "I should finish with Duchess." He didn't say anything else. He left the stable after a while, and I stood with Duchess and felt the specific cold of having put a wall back up somewhere I had been careful not to put one, and knowing that I had done it with both hands, deliberately, and being unable to stop myself. The distance between people who have said something honest to each other and then retreated from it has a specific quality, different from the distance of strangers, more complex, weighted with what was said, and also with what is not being said now. That was the distance of the following 2 weeks. Polite, professional, functional, exactly what we had been before September, with the specific addition of knowing that it was a choice. I told myself this was the correct outcome. I told myself it in the morning when I woke up, and in the evening when I lay in my cot listening to the ranch quiet, and I was convincing enough that I almost believed it on the good days. I had come here to get my head clear. I had come here for the work and the land and the simplicity. Starting something with my employer in an isolated context with no clear future was exactly the kind of decision that the version of me who had driven north from San Antonio in May would have called foolish. But the version of me who had sat on the South Ridge in October watching the light change with Colt's hand over mine was a different version, and he had opinions. Tamars, because Tamars was relentless, said on a Thursday morning, "You and the boss have a fight." "No," I said. "Something happened," he said. "Nothing happened," I said. He looked at me with the expression of someone who has watched enough humans to know when they're lying to his face, and said "Chem" in the specific resigned tone that had become his signature, and let it go. Hector, who noticed everything and said almost nothing, found me alone in the equipment shed one evening at the end of October and stood with me in companionable silence for a while before saying, without looking at me, "He's a good man, you know, private, takes him time to trust." And then he picked up the thing he'd come for and left, and I stood in the equipment shed for a long moment thinking about what that meant and in what context it had been offered. Colt was different in the distance than I expected him to be. He was not cold, not withdrawn, not pointed in his absence. He was himself, just without the new layer. He worked the ranch, managed the crew, was fair and decent and present in all the ways he had always been. If there was something effortful about it, and I thought sometimes there was, a controlled quality to his composure that hadn't been there before September, I couldn't be certain that I wasn't imagining it. I was composing the landscape of my own future in those 2 weeks, building a picture of what the following months would look like. Winter work on the ranch, professional and uncomplicated. Spring, probably leaving, finding what came next. Landscape architecture, maybe, or something adjacent to it that let me keep the land and lose the fluorescent lighting. Starting over again, but with better information about what I needed. This was a reasonable future. Straightforward, safe. I hated it with a comprehensiveness that was informative. October's second storm came in on a Thursday night. Not as severe as the August one, no lightning, just heavy sustained rain and wind that made the cedar breaks sound like the ocean. The horses needed checking. Of course they did. I went at 10. I brought a flashlight and my rain jacket, and I had not thought about whether Colt would be there or not, which was either true or the best lie I had told myself in 2 weeks. He was there, of course he was, standing in the stable aisle with a lantern, checking on Rosalind, who had her nose pressed against the stall boards and was trembling faintly. He looked up when I came in. And something in his expression when he saw me, something brief and unguarded, made my chest hurt in the specific way it had been hurting for 2 weeks. She all right, I said. She will be, he said. He kept his hand on her neck. Give her a minute. I walked the other stalls, giving him room. The horses were restless but manageable. The rain hammered the roof. When I got back to Rosalind's stall, she had settled, and Colt was leaning against the stable wall with his arms crossed and watching me walk back with the expression that I had learned was his version of saying something he hadn't figured out how to say yet. I stopped a few feet from him. In the lantern light, the stable was warm and amber, and outside the rain was insistent and consistent, and there was nowhere to go and no particular reason to pretend we were here only for the horses. I'm sorry, I said, for the way I shut it down. He looked at me. He didn't say anything, which was his version of listening. I got scared, I said. I have a history of I stopped, tried to say it right. I have a history of misreading situations, trusting my interpretation of something and finding out I was wrong. And when Esperanza mentioned the dinner and I didn't know what it meant, the first thing my brain went to was, you misread it again. And instead of talking to you about it, I just closed. He was very quiet for a moment, the rain. I wasn't going to the dinner, he said. My mother arranged it. I went because she was visiting and I didn't want to make it into something. It wasn't, he paused. It wasn't what I wanted. I know, I said, or I know now I should have asked. He looked down at his boots, the familiar gesture of someone thinking carefully. I've been trying to figure out how to come back from the last 2 weeks, he said. I didn't know how much pressure to apply. I didn't want to push you into something you weren't ready for. He looked up. I also didn't want to let it just be done. It's not done, I said. The words came out before I fully decided to say them, and they were true. He looked at me for a long moment. The lantern light moved slightly as the wind found a crack in the stable wall. No, he said. No, I said. He pushed off the wall and came toward me, and I stood still and let him come. He stopped when we were close enough that in the dim stable warmth I could see the specific dark of his eyes and the way the lantern light caught the edge of his jaw. He raised one hand, not quite touching my face, and I didn't move back, and the air between us was very small. I don't want to go slow forever, he said very quietly. Neither do I said. He put his hand against my jaw, warm and careful, and I closed my eyes for a moment at the contact, and when I opened them, he was watching me with an expression that was the least complicated thing I had ever seen on his face. Then he pressed his forehead to mine, and we stood like that in the stable with the rain outside and the horses breathing around us, and the warmth of it was something I thought I could have lived inside. We walked back across the yard together when the rain thinned, sometime past midnight. The air smelled of cedar and wet limestone. At the fork in the path where the bunkhouse track and the main house track diverged, we stopped and looked at each other, and I thought, this is a crossroads in a way that is larger than a path. Get some sleep, he said. You too, I said. But he was still standing there, and so was I, and neither of us was moving toward our respective directions. Raphael, he said. Yeah, I said. Tomorrow, he said, come to the main house for coffee, 7 o'clock. Okay, I said. And that was all. He went to his path and I went to mine, and I lay in my cot in the dark, with the rain thinning to nothing against the window, and felt the warmth of his hand against my jaw still present on my skin, and thought about 7 o'clock, with the particular quality of thinking about something you are afraid to want too much. I was at the main house at 7. The door was unlocked, as he had known it would be. He was in the kitchen, 2 mugs already on the table, the coffee made. The kitchen was the kind of kitchen that a house accumulates over generations, practical, slightly mismatched, full of objects that had history. A clock on the wall that probably needed adjusting. Curtains that looked like they were from a different decade. A wooden table worn smooth at the edges from years of hands and meals. He was standing at the window when I came in, looking at the morning. He turned, and he looked, I want to say this right, because it was specific, he looked settled. The word Drew had used, settled. We sat across the table from each other with our coffee, and we talked for an hour. Not about the night before or the 2 weeks before that, or the Friday porch conversation in September, just about the day ahead, the ranch, the horses, the winter work, and underneath all of it, everything that had been said, present and warm and not requiring repetition. After a while he said, "I want to know you better." "You know me pretty well already," I said. "No," he said. He was looking at his coffee mug. "I know the version of you who came here to have somewhere just about the work. I'd like to know the rest." I looked at him across the worn table in the morning kitchen light. "That's a long acquaintance," I said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Something about that, the simple, steady weight of it, settled into me and stayed. "Neither am I said. Winter on the ranch had a different character than summer, quieter, smaller, the crew reduced to Hector and Gil and me, the pace more deliberate. The hills went from green to gold to brown. The mornings were cold enough to see your breath, the afternoons brief and bright, the evenings long and dark and requiring fire. The rhythm of it was the most interior season I had ever lived through, which was appropriate, given what I was doing internally. Colt and I built something over those months that I don't have a single word for, so I'll use several. We built familiarity. We built trust of the specific kind that comes from being honest with someone multiple times and finding that they handle your honesty without breaking or retreating. We built a knowledge of each other that was detailed and real, his silences and what they meant, his particular humor that appeared rarely and was worth waiting for, the things that made him look out windows in the way he did when something was weighing on him. And from his end, my tendency to close up when afraid, my habit of noticing everything and saying less than I knew, the way I came alive in the mornings that matched his own rhythm exactly. We were careful and we were unhurried. There were evenings in the main house kitchen with the fire going, which began the week after the second storm and became, by December, simply where I was in the evenings. There were mornings on horseback in country that was beautiful in winter in a different and more austere way. There were conversations that went deep in the way that only the dark and the cold seemed to allow, and there were silences between those conversations that were comfortable and full rather than empty. He told me about being 21 and taking over the ranch when his father's health made it necessary, the weight of that, the grief of watching someone as capable and present as his father reduced. He told me about the loneliness of running something this isolated, of being responsible for a crew and a property and a legacy without many people to talk to about it honestly. He told me about knowing, since he was young, that what he felt and what the context expected of him were two different maps, and navigating between them carefully for years and the exhaustion of that navigation. I told him about landscape architecture and what it meant to me, the way it was connected to a need I had to understand how living things respond to their environment. I told him about my family and the specific complexity of growing up quiet in a loud house where emotional subtlety was not a primary language. I told him about Marcus, not as a wound to display, but as context, as part of the map he'd asked to see. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, full, real, present. No performance of listening, no waiting for his turn. Actually there with me in whatever I was saying. By January, I had been at the ranch for 8 months. By January, I knew that I was not leaving in spring. On a January evening, with snow on the hills that everyone said was unusual and that Colt said happened maybe once a decade, we sat on the main house porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the hills go white in the blue evening light. And he said, without preamble, "I love you." He said it the way he said most things, directly, plainly, without theatrical construction, and then he looked at me with that calm, open expression and waited. I thought about the word. I thought about what it meant coming from someone who did not use words carelessly, who had spent a long time navigating between his interior and his context, who had told me what he felt once before with the careful courage of someone not sure how the information would land. "I love you too," I said, and I meant it in the specific, settled, uncomplicated way that I had never quite meant it before, not the urgent, anxious love that needed constant reassurance, not the reaching love that tries to fill a gap, just the simple, grounded knowledge of it. I love you. As in, this is real and I am sure. He put his arm around my shoulders and I leaned against his side, and we sat on the porch while the snow continued to fall on the Texas hills in the rare way it did once a decade, and I felt the warmth of him against my side and the cold of the air on my face, and the particular quality of silence that comes only in snow, and I thought, here is the right place. Spring came back. It came the way it does in the hill country, tentatively at first, cold mornings and warm afternoons and bluebonnets on the south-facing slopes by early March. The seasonal crew came back. Tamaz and Dante returned from Uvalde, and Tamaz took approximately 48 hours to identify that something had changed and said nothing about it, which was, from Tamaz, the most generous response imaginable. The ranch woke back up into its summer rhythms, the big active season, cattle moving, fence lines, all of it. And in all of it, the thing between Colt and me was simply part of the life of the place, not hidden, but not performed either, just present, real in the way that real things are real. Hector, one morning in March, clapped me once on the shoulder and said, "Bueno," which seemed to encompass more than a single word should, but that was Hector. My uncle Rodrigo called in April and asked when I was coming back to San Antonio. I told him I didn't know if I was. He was quiet for a moment and then said, with the warmth of someone who has learned not to require explanations for the choices people make, "You sound good, whatever you're doing." "I'm staying a while longer," I said. "Good," he said. "The land there is nice, I'm told." "It is," I said, "very nice." Epilogue, a year later. In August, 1 year after I arrived at the Hargrove Ranch, with everything I owned in the back of my truck, and a very deliberate intention not to think too hard about anything, I rode out to the north fence line again, with Duchess beneath me and the early light turning the hills copper and gold. The fence was fine. I had fixed it myself in June, correctly this time, and it had held. I was out there because I liked the ride, because the North Ridge in August morning light was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen on a regular basis, and because Colt had asked me to check the creek crossing, and I had said yes the way I said yes to most things he asked now, easily, without calculation. I stopped on the ridge and looked at the valley below, the limestone creek, the cedar breaks, the hills rolling in every direction in the particular specific beauty of this place that I had come to know as mine in a way that nothing in San Antonio had ever quite been. I thought about the version of me who had arrived here running from something, looking for simplicity, and finding instead the most complicated and complete thing I had ever experienced. I thought about the word better that I had said in a stable office a year ago, and how much further than better I had come. I heard hoofbeats behind me and looked around to see Colt coming around the bend on Atlas, moving at an easy trot that he brought down to a walk when he reached me. He stopped beside me and looked at the valley the same way I had been looking at it, and then looked at me. "Fence," he said. "Fine," I said. He nodded. He looked back at the valley. "Good morning up here," he said. "Yeah," I said. We sat together on the ridge in the August light with the whole hill country spread below us, and I thought, caught in the moment. The title of this story, the thing the thumbnail asked, the question the giant cowboy's command began. I was caught in the moment. I had been caught in it for a year, in all the best possible meanings of the word, caught in the morning light, caught in the work, caught in the land, caught in the quiet and particular grace of a life that fit. And I was not, I knew, looking to be anything other than caught. Bell final hook. He looked at me on that ridge one more time, with those quiet dark eyes and that almost smile, and said 4 words I had not expected. And I said 4 words back. And the story, which you thought was ending here, it was only just beginning. Read if this story caught your heart the way Raphael was caught in that moment, like this video so more people find it. Television, subscribe for more interesting stories. Speech balloon, drop a comment. Do you think Raphael made the right choice staying? And what do you think Colt said those 4 words were?